Bhuto by Satyajit Ray. First published in Bengali in 1981. Translated by Gopa Majumdar. Naveen came back disappointed a second time. He had failed to get Akrur Babu's support. It was at a function in Uttarapara that Naveen had first learnt about Akrur Babu's amazing talent, ventriloquism. Naveen did not even know the word. Dvijapada had told him. Diju's father was a professor and had a library of his own. Diju had even taught him the correct spelling of the word. Akrur Chaudhary was the only person present on the stage, but he was conversing with someone invisible, hidden somewhere near the ceiling in the middle of the auditorium. Akrur Babu would throw a question at him. He would answer from above the audience's heads. "Harnath, how are you?" "I'm fine, thank you, sir." "Heard you have become interested in music. Is that true?" "Yes, sir." "Classical music?" "Yes, sir, classical music." "Do you sing yourself?" "No, sir." "Do you play an instrument?" "That's right, sir." "What kind of instrument? The sitar?" "No, sir." "Sarod?" "No, sir." "What do you play then?" "A gramophone, sir." The auditorium boomed with laughter and applause. Akrur Babu looked at the ceiling to ask a question, and then bent his head slightly to catch the reply. But it was impossible to tell that he was answering his own questions. His lips did not move at all. Naveen was astounded. He had to learn this art. Life would not be worth living if he did not. Could Akrur Chaudhary not be persuaded to teach him? Naveen was not very interested in studies. He had finished school, but had been sitting at home for the last 3 years. He simply did not feel like going in for further studies. Having lost his father in his childhood, he had been brought up by an uncle. His uncle wanted him to join his plywood business. But Naveen was interested in something quite different. His passion lay in learning magic. He had already mastered a few tricks at home. But after having seen a performance by Akrur Chaudhary, all that seemed totally insignificant. Naveen learned from the organizers of the show that Akrur Babu lived in Amherst Street in Calcutta. He took a train to Calcutta the very next day and made his way to the house of the man who, in his mind, had already become his guru. But the guru rejected his proposal outright. "What do you do?" was the first question the ventriloquist asked him. The sight of the man at close quarters was making Naveen's heart beat faster. About 45 years old, he sported a dark black bushy moustache, and his jet black hair, parted in the middle, rippled down to his shoulders. His eyes were droopy, though Naveen had seen them sparkle on stage under the spotlights. Naveen decided to be honest. "I have always been interested in magic," he said, "but your performance the other day got me passionately interested in ventriloquism." Akrur Babu shook his head. "This kind of art is not for all and sundry. You have to be extremely diligent. No one taught me this art. Go and try to learn it by yourself if you can." Naveen left, but only a week later he was back again, ready to fall at Akrur Babu's feet. During the last 7 days he had dreamt of nothing but ventriloquism. But this time things got worse. Akrur Babu practically threw him out of his house. "You should have realized the first time I was not prepared to teach you at all. This clearly shows your lack of perception and intelligence. No one can learn magic without these basic qualities, and certainly not my kind of magic." After the first visit, Naveen had returned feeling depressed. This time he got angry. Let Akrur Chaudhary go to hell. He would learn it all by himself. He bought a book on ventriloquism from College Street and began to practice. Everyone, including he himself, was surprised at his patience and perseverance. The basic rule was simple. There were only a few letters in the alphabet, like B, F, M, and P. that required one to close and open one's lips. If these letters could be pronounced slightly differently, there was no need to move the lips at all. But there was one other thing. When answering one's own questions, the voice had to be changed. This required a lot of practice, but Naveen finally got it right. When his uncle and some close friends openly praised him after a performance at home, he realized he had more or less mastered the art. But this was only the beginning. The days of the invisible audience were over. Modern ventriloquists used a puppet, specially designed so that it was possible to slip a hand under it and make its head turn and its lips move. When asked a question, it was the puppet who answered. Pleased with the progress he had made, his uncle offered to pay for such a puppet for Naveen. Naveen spent about a couple of weeks trying to think what his puppet should look like. Then he hit upon the most marvelous idea. His puppet would look exactly like Akrur Chaudhary. In other words, Akrur Babu would become a mere puppet in his hands. What a wonderful way to get his own back! Naveen had kept a photograph of Akrur Babu that he had once found on a hand poster. He now showed it to Adinath, the puppet maker. It must have moustaches like these, a middle parting, droopy eyes, and round cheeks. What fun it would be to have a puppet like that! Naveen hoped fervently that Akrur Babu would come to his shows. The puppet was ready in a week. Its clothes were also the same as Akrur Chaudhary's. A black high-necked coat and a white dhoti under it, tucked in at the waist. Naveen happened to know Sasadar Bose of the Netaji Club. It was not difficult to get himself included in one of their functions. He was an instant hit. His puppet had been given a name, Bhutnath. Bhuto for short. The audience thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Bhuto, Naveen told him, was a supporter of the East Bengal Football Club, and he himself supported their opponents Mohan Bagan. The verbal exchange was so chirpy that no one noticed Bhuto say East Bengal and Mohan Agan. Naveen became famous practically overnight. Invitations from other clubs began pouring in. He even started to appear on television. There was now no need to worry about his future. He had found a way to earn his living. At last, one day, Akrur Babu came to meet him. Naveen had, in the meantime, left Uttarapara and moved into a flat in Mirzapur Street in Calcutta. His landlord, Suresh Mutsudi, was a nice man. He knew of Naveen's success and treated him with due respect. Naveen had performed recently in Mahajati Sadan and received a lot of acclaim. The organizers of various functions were now vying with one another to get Naveen to perform for them. Naveen himself had changed over the last few months. Success had given him a new confidence and self-assurance. Akrur Babu had probably got his address from the organizers of a show in Mahajati Sadan. Bhuto and he had talked about the underground railway that evening. You know about Patal Rail in Calcutta, don't you, Bhuto? No, I don't. That is strange. Everyone in Calcutta knows about it. Bhuto shook his head. No, I haven't heard of that one, but I do know of Hospital Rail. Hospital Rail? Of course, it's a huge operation, I hear. The whole city is being cut open under intensive care. What else would you call it but Hospital Rail? Today, Naveen was writing a new script on load shedding. He had realized that what the audience liked best were subjects that they could relate to. Load shedding, crowded buses, rising prices. His script was coming along quite well when suddenly someone knocked on the door. Naveen got up to open it and was completely taken aback to find Akrur Babu standing outside. May I come in? Of course. Naveen offered him his chair. Akrur Babu did not sit down immediately. His eyes were fixed on Bhuto. Bhuto was lying on the table totally inert. Akrur Babu went forward, picked him up, and began examining his face closely. There was nothing that Naveen could do. He had started to feel faintly uneasy, but the memory of his humiliation at Akrur Babu's house had not faded from his mind. So you have turned me into a puppet in your hands? Akrur Babu finally sat down. Why did you do this? Naveen said. That should not be too difficult to understand. I had come to you with great hope. You crushed it totally. But I must say this. This puppet, this image of yours, has brought me all my success. I am able to live decently only because of it. Akrur Babu was still staring at Bhuto. He said, I don't know if you have heard this already. I had a show in Barasat the other day. The minute I arrived on the stage, the catcalls began. Bhuto, Bhuto. Surely you realize this was not a very pleasant experience for me. I may be responsible in a way for your success, but you are beginning to threaten my livelihood. Did you think I would accept a situation like this so easily? It was dark outside. There was no electricity. 2 candles flickered in Naveen's room. Akrur Babu's eyes glowed in the light just as Naveen had seen them glow on the stage. The little man cast a huge shadow on the wall. Bhutnath lay on the table as droopy-eyed as ever, silent and immobile. You may not be aware of this, said Akrur Babu, but my knowledge of magic isn't limited only to ventriloquism. From the age of 18 to 38, I stayed with an unknown but amazingly gifted magician, learning his art. No, not here in Calcutta. He lived in a remote place at the foothills of the Himalayas. Have you ever shown on stage any of those other items you learned? No, I haven't, because those are not meant for the stage. I had promised my guru never to use that knowledge simply to earn a living. I have kept my word. But what are you trying to tell me now? I don't understand. I have come only to warn you, although I must admit I have been impressed by your dedication. No one actually taught me the art of ventriloquism. I had to teach myself, just as you have done. Professional magicians do not teach anyone else the real tricks of the trade. They have never done so. But I am not prepared to tolerate the impertinence you have shown in designing your puppet. That is all I came to tell you. Akrur Babu rose from his chair. Then he glanced at Bhutnath and said, My hair and my moustaches have only recently started to grey. I can see that you have, in anticipation, already planted a few grey strands in your puppet's hair. All right then, I'll take my leave now. Akrur Babu left. Naveen closed the door and stood before Bhutnath. Grey hair? Yes, 1 or 2 were certainly visible. He had not noticed these before, which was surprising since he held the puppet in his hand and spoke to it so often. How could he have been so unobservant? Anyway, there was no point in wasting time thinking about it. Anyone could make a mistake. He had obviously concentrated only on Bhuto's face and not looked at his hair closely enough. But it was impossible to rid himself of a sneaking suspicion. The next day, he stuffed Bhuto into the leather case made especially for him and went straight to Adinath Pal. There he brought Bhuto out of the case, laid him flat on the ground and said, Look at these few strands of grey hair. Did you put these in? Adinath Pal seemed quite taken aback. Why, no. Why should I? You did not ask for a mixture of black and grey hair, did you? Could you not have made a mistake? Yes, of course. Those few strands might have pasted purely by mistake. But would you not have noticed it immediately when you came to collect the puppet? You know what I think. I do believe someone has planted these deliberately without your knowledge. Perhaps he was right. The whole thing had happened without his knowledge. A strange thing happened at the function organized by the Friends Club in Chetla. A clear evidence of Bhuto's popularity was that the organizers had saved his item for the last. In the midst of a rather interesting dialogue on the subject of load shedding, Naveen noticed that Bhuto was uttering words that were not in the script. These included difficult words in English which Naveen himself never used. He hardly knew what they meant. This was a totally new experience for Naveen, although it made no difference to the show, for the words were being used quite appropriately and drawing frequent applause from the crowd. Thank goodness, none of them knew Naveen had not even been to college. But this unexpected behavior of his puppet upset Naveen. He kept feeling that some unseen force had assumed control, pushing him into the background. Upon reaching home after the show, he closed the door of his room and placed Bhuto under a table lamp. Did Bhuto have that little mole on his forehead before? No, he most certainly did not. Naveen had noticed a similar mole on Akrur Babu's forehead only the other day. It was really quite small, not easily noticeable unless one looked carefully. But now it had appeared on Bhuto's face. And that was not all. There was something else. At least 10 more strands of grey hair and deep, dark rings under the eyes. These were definitely not there before. Naveen began pacing up and down impatiently. He was beginning to feel decidedly uneasy. He believed in magic, but his kind of magic was something in which man was in full control. For Naveen, anything to do with the supernatural was not just unacceptable, it was evil. He could see signs of evil in the changes in Bhuto. At the same time, however, it was impossible to think of Bhuto as anything other than an inert, lifeless object, a mere puppet in his hands, despite his droopy eyes and the slight smile on his lips. And yet, his whole appearance was undergoing a change. It was Naveen's belief that the same changes were taking place in Akrur Babu. He too must have started to go grey. His eyes too must have got dark circles under them. Naveen had the habit of talking to Bhuto every now and then, simply to practice his technique. Their conversation went like this. "It's rather hot today, isn't it, Bhuto?" "Yes, it's very stuffy." "But you have an advantage, don't you? You don't sweat and perspire." "How can I not get sweat and aspire? Ha 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 ha." Today Naveen asked him quite involuntarily, "What on earth is going on, Bhuto? Why is all this happening?" Bhuto's reply startled him. "Karwa, karwa." "Karma?" The word slipped out through Naveen's lips just as it would have done on the stage, but he knew he had not said it consciously. Someone had made him utter that word, and he felt he knew who that someone might be. That night he refused his dinner despite repeated requests from his cook. Normally he slept quite well, but tonight he took a pill to help him sleep. At around 1 in the morning the pill began to work. Naveen put down the magazine he was reading, switched off the light and fell asleep. Only a little while later, however, he opened his eyes. Who had been coughing in the room? Was it he himself? But he did not have a cough. And yet it seemed as though someone at close quarters was coughing very softly. He switched on the lamp. Bhutnath was still sitting in the same spot, motionless, but he now appeared to be slouching a little with his right arm flung across his chest. Naveen looked at the clock. It was 3:30. The chowkidar outside was doing his rounds, beating his stick on the ground. A dog barked in the distance. An owl flew past his house, hooting raucously. Someone next door obviously had a cough, and a gust of wind must have made Bhuto bend forward slightly. There was no earthly reason to feel scared today, in the 20th century, living in a busy street of a large city like Calcutta. Naveen switched off the light and fell asleep once more. The next day, for the first time in his career, he experienced failure. The Finlay Recreation Club had invited him to their annual function. A large audience was packed into an enormous hall. As usual, his item was the last. Songs, recitations, a Kathak recital, and then ventriloquism by Naveen Munshi. Before setting off from home, he had done all that he always did to take care of his voice. He knew how important it was for a ventriloquist to have a clear throat. His voice sounded perfectly normal before he went on stage. In fact, he noticed nothing wrong when he asked Bhuto the first question. Disaster struck when it was Bhuto's turn to speak. His voice sounded hoarse, like that of a man suffering from an acute attack of cough and cold. Naveen knew the audience could not hear a word Bhuto was saying. Strangely enough, it was only Bhuto's voice that seemed to be affected. His own still sounded normal. "Louder, please!" yelled a few people from the back. Those sitting in the front rows were too polite to yell, but it was obvious that they could not hear anything either. Naveen tried for another 5 minutes and then had to withdraw, defeated. Never had he felt so embarrassed. He declined the organizer's offer to pay him his fee. He could not accept any money under the circumstances. But surely this horrible situation could not last forever? In spite of his embarrassment, Naveen still believed that soon things would return to normal. It was a very hot and sultry night, and over and above there was this new and unpleasant experience. When Naveen returned home at about 11:30, he was feeling positively sick. For the first time, he began to feel a little annoyed with Bhuto, although he knew Bhuto could not really be blamed for anything. His failure was his own fault. He placed Bhuto on the table and opened one of the windows. There was not much hope of getting a cool breeze, but whatever came in was a welcome relief, for there was a power cut again. Today being Saturday, Naveen knew the power supply would not be restored before midnight. He lit a candle and set it down on the table. Its light fell on Bhuto, and Naveen went cold with fear. There were beads of perspiration on Bhuto's forehead. But was that all? No. His face had lost its freshness. The cheeks looked sunken. His eyes were red. Even in a situation like this, Naveen could not help but take a few steps forward towards his puppet. It was as though he had to find out what further shocks and horrors were in store. But something made him stop almost immediately. There was a movement on Bhuto's chest. Under the high-neck jacket, his chest rose and fell. Bhuto was breathing. Could his breathing be heard? Yes, it could. In the totally silent night, 2 people breathed in Naveen's room instead of 1. It was perhaps both his fear and amazement that made Naveen exclaim softly, "Bhuto!" And immediately another voice spoke, the sound of which made Naveen reel back to his bed. "This is not Bhuto. I am Akrur Chaudhary." Naveen knew he had not spoken the words. The voice was the puppet's own. Heaven knows through what magical powers Akrur Chaudhary could make it speak. Naveen had wanted to turn Akrur Babu into a puppet in his hand. But never did he expect anything like this. It was impossible for him to stay in the same room with the puppet that had come to life. He must leave. But what was that? Was the sound of Bhuto's breathing growing faint? Yes, so it was. Bhuto had stopped breathing. The beads of perspiration on his forehead had gone. His eyes were no longer red, and the dark rings had vanished. Naveen rose from his bed and picked him up. Something queer had happened in this short time. It was no longer possible to move Bhuto's head or open his lips. The mechanical parts had got jammed. Perhaps a little more force would help. Naveen tried to twist the head forcibly. It came apart and fell onto the table with a clatter. In the morning, Naveen ran into his landlord, Suresh Mutsudi, on the staircase. "Why, Mr. Munshi, you never showed me your magic with the puppet," he complained. "Ventriloquium, or whatever it is called." "I have given that up," said Naveen. "I'll try something new now. But why do you ask?" "One of your fellow performers died yesterday. Saw it in the papers this morning. Akrur Chaudhary." "Really?" Naveen had not yet looked at the newspaper. "What happened to him?" "Heart attack," said Suresh Babu. "Nearly 70% of people seem to die of heart attack nowadays." Naveen knew that if anyone bothered to inquire about the time of his death, they would discover that the man had died exactly 10 minutes after midnight.